Well, good morning, students. I wanted to walk with you through the Dasgupta essay you've been assigned called "Listening is Freedom." Um, I wanted to walk through it with you because I think it's a difficult essay, and it's somewhat introducing a new set of issues that you might not be familiar with yet. Let me begin by reminding you that you've already watched a video presentation by Dasgupta where she affirmed the concept of narrative and cultural humility as an alternative to the idea of narrative or cultural competence. Remember, her idea of humility suggested two things: bringing an awareness of our own particular perspective to our analysis of others, but also a sense that others, particularly others who come from different cultures or different backgrounds, but really all others, always remain somewhat of a mystery to us. That is to say, there is an aspect of everyone's personhood that is in some sense inaccessible to others, but especially when we're crossing big cultural boundaries. Now, one of the things I want you to notice about this essay, first and foremost, is the phrase social justice in the subtitle. That should signal to you that here she has a particular concern about injustice, you might say, or imbalances of power or discrimination and their relevance to issues of the interpretation of narratives. Something you could not have known, but this essay in the Health Humanities textbook appears in a section called Race and Class. All this, of course, to alert you that concerns about inequality, discrimination, injustice are central to this essay in its analysis of stories, narratives, and how we interpret them. An important background or introductory theme to Dasgupta's essay is this idea of mutuality or even intersubjectivity in storytelling. She insists that stories form a relationship between the teller and the listener. She even uses the phrase co-author. She says teller and listener co-author stories. The listener, she says, is also a subject in the story. What's she getting at here? Well, clearly when you or I read a poem or a short story or a novel, that literature expresses the subjectivity of its author. But her point is here that when you or I read it, what the story means, what its significance is, depends upon our own subjectivity as the reader or the listener. She also makes the interesting point that it's not just storytelling that has this component of intersubjectivity, but also healing, or you might say the patient-professional relationship, and even teaching. My relationship with you has this element of intersubjectivity. An example of this when it comes to teaching, students will often ask me about my course. And one of my responses always is, it's not my course, it's your course. Or at least maybe it's our course. What it means, what you get out of it, depends upon what you bring to it. Now, it's at the end of this introductory section where she talks about intersubjectivity that she introduces the true theme of this chapter. She says, stories are not just intersubjective and mutual, they're also about power. They're about the differentials in power that might exist between the teller and the listener. She raises questions like whose story counts, that we should always be asking ourselves, whose story counts? Who owns the story? Who's in control of the story? What voices or stories are not being heard in the story? Now, she says those questions are always important, but they are especially important in relation to what she calls vulnerable stories. That is to say, the stories of people who are parts of groups that have traditionally had less power or been discriminated against or abused or victims of injustice in some way. There's a key paragraph at the end of the introduction that I want to go through with you, because I think it really says some significant things for understanding what Dasgupta is trying to convey to us. She writes, moreover, examinations of interpersonal and socio-political power are integral to approaching mutuality and equality in the intersubjective encounter. So understanding the intersubjectivity of storytelling means we better pay attention to power. We must ask additional questions. What is the role of the witness in eliciting and co-constructing the illness story? I think she's trying to make us aware, for example, when we talk about prompting or enhancing or appreciating the stories of patients, that the healthcare professional, the doctor, plays a role in eliciting that story, and that doctor often has power in the relationship with the patient. How does that affect the story? And what is the physician's or the healthcare professional's responsibility given his or her power in bringing the story out? How often do the stories that people tell us reflect what we as witnesses to the story have made clear that we expect in that illness story? We should always be aware of what such stories do to us. She continues, these are compelling in regard to any illness story, but they are particularly so in regard to vulnerable stories, narratives whose tellers are traditionally marginalized or silenced owing to their cultural, social, sexual, or economic identities. It's not enough then to think about the listener-teller dyad and all the narrative nuance of a story, like plot or frame or genre, without contextualizing that listener and teller in broader social contexts. So this contextualizing the broader social context means we should pay attention to the race of the teller of the story as opposed to the listener. If the teller is African American and the listener is white, that introduces a dynamic into the intersubjectivity of this relationship that we need to be sensitive to and aware of. If the teller is a person of a different culture from the listener, if the teller of the story is poor and maybe politically marginalized, but the listener is relatively wealthy and politically powerful, all of that is relevant to the dynamic. Finally, she writes, at the same time, it's not enough to draw broad conclusions based on sociopolitics without examining the way that these issues are manifested in particular unique individuals and their stories, because, of course, any group is composed of heterogeneous people with heterogeneous idiosyncratic stories. The key is simultaneously listening to multiple levels of narratives, the individual and the social, the personal and the institutional, if we are to engage with the political underpinnings of narrative acts and to think about our responsibilities in witnessing narratives from the margins. So what she's warning against here is we should be attentive to the economic, the racial, the cultural, the sexual identities that people bring to their encounters with us and the stories they tell us. But we should not then engage in stereotyping as if that because this person is bisexual and poor, that automatically they have these characteristics. No, we must always attend to the individuality and the particularity of the individual whose story we are being told. So this slide summarizes what I think the three essential points are from that very revealing and provocative introductory paragraph in this essay. The rest of Dasgupta's essay is dedicated to three pieces of work, one a book and the other two documentary films, which she has used in her health humanities class. She offers critiques of those works based upon these concerns about power that she has introduced here in the introductory section. In the next presentation, I'll unpack for you each of these pieces of work and her critiques of them.